I am the centurion that was at the base of the cross when Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. You may be wondering what the word centurion means. From it comes the word century, and century means 100. I commanded 100 men. I was their trainer, their disciplinarian. I was the one who told them what to do. I was their leader. And I would lead them into battle, and when I led them into battle, they could see my shiny helmet so that they could always see where I was, because I was their leader. I was there at the crucifixion of Jesus. I was the centurion who oversaw everything that happened that day. And I want to tell you, it was a day that changed my life forever. I led Jesus up to Golgotha. I nailed him to the cross along with the help of some of my cohorts. And what we saw the next 6 hours, what we heard the next 6 hours was incredible. And as I said, life-changing. We heard him speak as people were mocking his name and calling out, divinity he was, divinity he is. If you're the Christ, save yourself and us. Not only were people saying that at the base of the cross, but the criminals on each side were saying the very same thing. And what did I hear this Jesus of Nazareth say? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And a few moments later, he turned to one of the thieves. And the thief said something like this, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And this Jesus of Nazareth said this, verily I say today, you will be with me in paradise. Paradise. I didn't know what that meant then. I do now. A few moments passed, and then he looked down on his mother and he said, Mother, there is your son. Son, take care of my mom. And then suddenly, just a few minutes later, it became as dark as night. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And suddenly I heard the voice of Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then an hour passed, maybe two, and he didn't say anything until finally he cried out at his thirst that he was thirsty. I looked for water and there was none, and so I found a sponge and there was vinegar nearby, and I took my sword and I had the sponge attached to it, and I attached it to the sponge, and then I dipped the sponge in the vinegar and I lifted it up to his face. He drank none of it. And then a few moments passed, and he said these words in a loud, almost victorious, almost triumphant voice. He said, it is finished. Then he looked heavenward and said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. At that very moment, the earth shook, and the rocks around all that area were starting to split. It was as dark as night, and something was moving inside my heart. I realized at that moment that this could not be just any other man. And here's part of the reason I thought that. Just the night before, one of my cohorts was in what they call the Garden of Gethsemane. And what happened that night? I'll never forget it. He said that one of Jesus' followers took a sword and cut off his ear right in front of everyone. And Jesus suddenly just touched the side of his face. And the ear was restored. My cohort told me that story that night. And so immediately I thought there's something different about this man. So as I stood there at the base of the cross and I heard these amazing words from Jesus, and I studied his demeanor and I watched his character and I listened to his words, something was moving inside of me. I had heard that people proclaimed him to be the Son of God. I had heard that he himself said that he was the Son of God, and now I was ready to join them in those accolades. The words were bubbling in my heart. The earthquake had just finished. I looked up at this middle man in the cross and I said, surely this was the Son of God. And men around me who also were part of my army said the very same thing. This was the Son of God. Was the Son of God. Do you know what this Jesus of Nazareth did? 3 days later, he conquered death. Some women went to anoint what they thought would be the dead body of Jesus, and he wasn't there. The stone was rolled away. I heard an angel sat on top of that stone and said that Jesus was alive. And the women went to tell the disciples, and then that news spread all around the countryside. It even came to us in the Roman Centurion army. And since I knew that Jesus had healed this soldier's ear, since I saw the things that I saw that day, this was just validation for me that my confession that night, that Good Friday night, had to be true. That Jesus was and is the Son of God. Was the Son of God. Is the Son of God. You see, Jesus was around the countryside of Galilee and also in Jerusalem, making many appearances after he rose from the dead. He did that for 40 days to give irrefutable, undeniable evidence that he really was who he claimed to be. This Son of God not only died on a cross for the world's sins, but he rose from the dead and gave irrefutable evidence that he was alive. This was the message of the New Testament. This was the message of the early church. This was the message that I took to my dying day, that Jesus not only was, but is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the confession I had the day I died. And then paradise was mine. You see the word indifference up on that wall. Most of my life, I was indifferent towards the things of God. I didn't need God in my life. And even that day, as the day began, when I saw the Son of God nailed to the cross, I was indifferent towards the whole story. I was indifferent towards the claim that Jesus was the Christ. But as the hours went by, there was no doubt in my mind that he was who he claimed to be. No longer was I indifferent towards the message of the gospel. There may have been times in your life when you too were indifferent towards Jesus. Maybe you weren't as committed to him as you thought you should be. Maybe you weren't in church as regularly as you should have been. Maybe you said things about your love and allegiance and devotion towards Jesus, but then you turned around and did things that just seemingly seemed opposite of the confession you made. Many times in our lives, we are indifferent towards the things of God, indifferent towards the counsel of his word. But one thing I realize now, that on that Good Friday, Jesus was paying for the sin of indifference. He died for your sin of indifference. And now, because of what Jesus did, because of what I saw on that Good Friday, I know that my sins are forgiven. I know that heaven was my eternal home because of what Jesus did that Good Friday. The very first words I heard come from his lips saying that he would forgive, and he asked the Father to forgive. That forgives my indifference. That forgives your indifference too. And to know that that forgiveness, that promise of paradise that Jesus talked about that first Good Friday, that was mine. Because with the eyes that I beheld the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, I believed. And it's my prayer that you believe too. I heard from those who followed Jesus in the years that followed that Jesus at one time asked his followers, "Who does the world say that I am?" And many of his followers said, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist, and others say that you're Elijah, and others say that you're one of the prophets of the Old Testament who's risen from the dead." But then Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." I ask you tonight, who do you say Jesus is? Is he just a gifted teacher, a marvelous orator, a tremendous speaker, or is he who he claimed to be? The Son of God, the Savior of the world, my King, my Redeemer, my Lord, my Shepherd. My confession that day was Jesus was the Christ. May your confession be today that Jesus is your Christ, your Savior, your Lord, your King, the Son of God, who was, who is, and forever will be. May your confession be Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God.